December 23, 1945, Fort McClellan, Alabama. The winter air carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke across the sprawling prisoner of war compound. Inside Recreation Hall B, a massive white bedsheet hung taut against the northern wall, transformed into an improvised cinema screen. 73 Japanese women sat in rigid rows on wooden folding chairs, their backs straight, hands folded in laps, eyes fixed forward with the disciplined stillness of soldiers awaiting orders. Most wore the standard-issue POW uniforms, simple cotton dresses in neutral grey, but their posture betrayed their former ranks. These were not ordinary prisoners. These were officers of the Imperial Japanese Women's Auxiliary Corps, nurses who had commanded field hospitals, communications specialists who had decoded enemy transmissions, administrative officers who had managed supply chains across the Pacific Theater. They had been captured on Okinawa, Saipan, and Tinian during the final brutal months of the war. They had expected execution. They had prepared for death with the same stoic acceptance they had been trained to embrace since childhood. Instead, they found themselves in Alabama, where American guards wore easy smiles and spoke in drawling accents they could barely comprehend. And now, incomprehensibly, impossibly, those same guards were threading celluloid through a 16mm projector, preparing to show them a motion picture. The women waited in confused silence as the lights dimmed. The projector began its mechanical chatter. A beam of light cut through the darkness. And then, impossibly, Margaret O'Brien appeared on the makeshift screen, a child actress in Technicolor glory, and several of the Japanese officers gasped aloud despite their training, despite their discipline, despite everything they had been taught about maintaining composure before the enemy. They had been taught that Americans were beasts. This lesson had been delivered with methodical consistency throughout their military training, reinforced in every briefing, every propaganda film, every lecture on enemy psychology. American soldiers, they learned, were subhuman creatures driven by base instincts, greed, lust, violence. American culture was spiritually bankrupt, a hollow civilization built on materialism and moral decay. American women were promiscuous and weak. American men were cowards who relied on superior numbers and industrial production rather than warrior spirit. The instructors at the Imperial Women's Auxiliary Training Facility in Osaka had been explicit and graphic in their descriptions. Captured Japanese women, they warned, would be subjected to torture, rape, and execution. The Americans would show no mercy, no honor, no recognition of the Bushido code that elevated warriors above common criminals. If captured, the only honorable course was suicide. Many of the women sitting in Recreation Hall B had attempted exactly that. Lieutenant Haruko Yamamoto, seated in the third row, still bore the scar on her left wrist where she had cut deep with a surgical scalpel in the moments before American Marines burst into her field hospital on Saipan. The blade had been clean and sharp. Her intention had been absolute. But an American Navy corpsman had tied a tourniquet with shocking speed and efficiency, had spoken soft words in incomprehensible English, had treated her wound with the same professional care he would have given his own comrades. She had been too weak from blood loss to resist. She had expected death to follow recovery. Instead, she received 3 meals daily, medical treatment that surpassed what she had been able to provide her own wounded soldiers, and now this emotion picture, as if she were a civilian on holiday rather than a defeated enemy officer. The film playing before them was Meet Me in St. Louis, a 1944 Technicolor musical directed by Vincent Minnelli, starring Judy Garland at the height of her wholesome American beauty. The choice was deliberate, though the Japanese women could not have known this. The psychological warfare specialists at the Pentagon had studied the question of Japanese POW indoctrination with scientific rigor. Reports from field interrogators indicated that Japanese prisoners, particularly female officers, suffered from severe cognitive dissonance upon capture. Their training had prepared them for brutality. When they encountered humane treatment instead, their ideological framework fractured. The question then became how to leverage that fracture, how to demonstrate American cultural superiority without overt propaganda, how to show rather than tell. The answer, the specialists concluded, lay in normalcy. Show them American life at its most ordinary, most domestic, most abundantly casual. Show them families gathering for holidays. Show them neighborhoods where children played without fear. Show them a world where young women sang about the boy next door rather than dying with grenades clutched to their chests. Show them Technicolor when they expected black and white brutality. Show them music when they expected screams. Show them, meet me in SD. Louis. The women watched in stunned silence as the Smith family celebrated Christmas in their comfortable SD. Louis' home. The production design depicted a large Victorian house with electric lights, indoor plumbing, central heating, and rooms dedicated to leisure rather than mere survival. The family owned a telephone. The teenage daughters wore multiple elaborate dresses throughout the film, suggesting wardrobes of abundance rather than the single spare uniform most Japanese families possessed by 1944. They ate elaborate meals with multiple courses. They sang for entertainment. They worried about social dances and romantic interests rather than air raids and starvation rations. Lieutenant Yamamoto felt something unfamiliar and disturbing twist in her chest as she watched. She had commanded a field hospital that treated wounded soldiers on dirt floors with inadequate anesthesia and recycled bandages. She had rationed medical supplies so strictly that minor infections often proved fatal. She had watched young men die from treatable wounds because Japan's supply lines had collapsed under the weight of American submarine warfare. She had gone to sleep hungry more nights than not during the final year of the war. And now she sat in an Alabama recreation hall, recently fed a dinner of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and apple pie, watching American actors pretend to live in a world of such casual abundance that they could afford to worry about whether the boy next door would attend a dance. The cognitive dissonance was not unique to Lieutenant Yamamoto. Throughout the wooden chairs of Recreation Hall B, Japanese women officers grappled with the same internal crisis. Everything they had been taught was being contradicted by direct experience. Ensign Keika Matsuda, former communications officer with the Imperial Navy, had grown up in Tokyo believing that Japan's conquest of Asia was necessary because the home islands lacked natural resources. They needed Manchurian coal, Indonesian oil, Malayan rubber. They needed Lebensraum, living space for an expanding population on resource-poor islands. The war, she had been taught, was a matter of survival. Japan fought because it had no choice. America, with its vast territories and abundant resources, sought to strangle Japan economically, to force the proud Yamada race into permanent subservience to white Western powers. This narrative had made sense to her throughout the war. It had justified the sacrifices. But now, watching this motion picture in this warm recreation hall after eating more food in one meal than her mother had seen in a week by 1945, the narrative began to crack. If America possessed such overwhelming abundance, so vast and casual that Hollywood studios spent hundreds of thousands of dollars producing entertainment films during wartime while Japan struggled to feed its soldiers, then what had the war been about? If America could afford to treat enemy officers with heated buildings, medical care, regular meals, and recreational films, what did that say about the supposed barbarism of American culture? The evidence of American abundance surrounded them constantly, but the film made it visceral in a way that daily POW camp life could not. The Japanese women had noticed the waste. In the mess hall, American guards threw away food that would have fed a Japanese family for days. The camp generated trash in quantities that seemed obscene to women raised in a culture of material scarcity and ritual conservation. The guards wore uniforms that appeared to be replaced regularly rather than mended and remended until they fell apart. The vehicles in the motor pool outnumbered the prisoners. The medical supplies in the camp infirmary exceeded what Lieutenant Yamamoto had possessed for an entire field hospital serving thousands of wounded soldiers. But these observations could be rationalized as specific to military installations. Perhaps, the women told themselves, this was merely a temporary concentration of resources for the purpose of guarding prisoners. Perhaps ordinary American life was different. Perhaps the soldiers guarding them were elite troops given special privileges. Meet me in SD. Louis demolished these rationalizations. The film depicted not soldiers but civilians, not elites but an ordinary middle-class family. The house was not a mansion but a typical large home of the American Midwest. The abundance was not exceptional but normal. The casual waste of resources was not military excess but civilian baseline. When the Smith family discarded a dress because it was out of fashion, when they left lights burning in empty rooms, when they served elaborate meals as everyday occurrences, the message was clear. This was standard American life. This was what ordinary Americans expected as normal. This was the civilization that Japan had chosen to attack. Captain Michiko Tanaka, seated in the front row, had been among the highest-ranking women captured during the Battle of Okinawa. She had managed logistics for an entire regiment, coordinating supply distribution across the island's defensive positions. She knew numbers. She understood industrial capacity. She had read the intelligence reports that estimated American production figures, though she had dismissed them as propaganda exaggerations. No nation could produce 60,000 aircraft annually. No economy could manufacture a Liberty ship in 42 days. The numbers were impossible. They had to be lies designed to damage Japanese morale. But watching this film, seeing the casual abundance depicted as normalcy for a middle-class family in 1903 for decades before the war, Captain Tanaka began to recalculate. The industrial capacity required to produce a Technicolor film was itself staggering. The cameras, the lights, the film stock, the processing laboratories, the distribution network. The thousands of movie theaters across America showing these films to millions of civilians who could afford ticket prices even during wartime. Japan had possessed nothing comparable. Japanese cinema existed, certainly, but it was a small industry producing mainly propaganda films on limited budgets with black and white stock. The idea of producing an elaborate musical comedy in full color while simultaneously fighting a global war on two fronts was incomprehensible. The resources required for this single motion picture a piece of entertainment. Not military hardware would have supplied her entire regiment for months. The film continued its cheerful narrative, and the Japanese women continued watching in silence. But their minds were working, recalculating, reassessing. When Judy Garland sang "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," her voice rich and clear through the recreation hall speakers, Lieutenant Yamamoto found tears forming despite her best efforts at control. The song was in English. She understood perhaps one word in 5, but the emotion was universal, and the stark contrast was overwhelming. She remembered Christmas 1944. Though Japan did not celebrate the holiday, she remembered the cold, the hunger, the wounded soldiers crying in the darkness of the field hospital, the ammunition shortages, the knowledge that American forces were closing in on the home islands, the absolute certainty that she would die soon. She had accepted that death. She had prepared for it. She had been ready. And now she sat warm and fed in Alabama, watching Margaret O'Brien worry about whether Santa Claus would visit her house, and the absurdity was so complete that tears came unbidden. She was not alone. Throughout the recreation hall, Japanese women officers wept silently. Some covered their faces with their hands, others let the tears fall openly, too overwhelmed for shame. The American guards stationed at the doors noticed but did not comment. They had been briefed on possible reactions. The psychological warfare specialists had predicted this. The reports had used clinical language, ideological disintegration, cognitive framework collapse, emotional breakthrough indicating receptivity to democratic re-education. But watching it happen in real time, seeing these rigid, disciplined officers break down in tears over a Hollywood musical, even the guards felt the weight of what was occurring. This was not military victory. This was cultural demolition. This was the moment when the myth of Japanese superiority encountered the reality of American abundance and shattered like glass against concrete. The historical record of Japanese POW camps provided context for this moment of reckoning. By December 1945, American forces held approximately 56,000 Japanese prisoners of war, a remarkably small number given the scale of the Pacific War. Japanese military doctrine emphasized death before surrender. The Senjinkan, the military field code issued in 1941, explicitly forbade surrender under any circumstances. Soldiers were expected to fight to the death or commit suicide. Civilians in occupied territories were instructed to do likewise. The result was a war of extraordinary brutality where surrender was so rare that American forces developed specific protocols for handling the psychological trauma of the few who did capitulate. Japanese prisoners often arrived in a state of profound shock. They had violated the deepest principles of their military training. They had dishonored themselves, their families, their ancestors, and the emperor. Many expected immediate execution. Many wanted it. American policy was to demonstrate the opposite at every opportunity. Show them that surrender did not mean death. Show them that American captivity meant food, medical care, shelter, and humane treatment. Show them that the propaganda they had believed was false. Show them motion pictures. The film program at Fort McClellan was part of a broader psychological warfare strategy that extended across all Japanese POW facilities in American custody. The program began in early 1945 as interrogators noticed that Japanese prisoners, once they overcame their initial shock, became remarkably cooperative. Unlike German POWs, who often maintained ideological conviction even in captivity, Japanese prisoners seemed to undergo complete psychological reorientation. Researchers at the War Department studied this phenomenon extensively. The conclusion was that Japanese military indoctrination, while creating soldiers willing to die rather than surrender, was actually quite brittle. It relied on maintaining a complete ideological bubble where contradictory information never penetrated. Japanese soldiers were told that Americans were barbaric, that surrender meant torture and death, that Japan was winning the war, that the emperor was divine, that Japanese culture was superior, that sacrifice was glorious. When actual experience contradicted any single element of this narrative, the entire structure became suspect. If Americans were not barbaric, what else was false? If Japan was losing rather than winning, what did that say about national superiority? If the emperor's armies were defeated by a supposedly inferior civilization, was the divine mandate genuine? The questions cascaded, the framework collapsed, and the prisoners became remarkably receptive to alternative narratives, particularly when those narratives were demonstrated rather than argued. Hence the film programs. Fort McClellan screened movies twice weekly for Japanese POWs. The selections were carefully curated. No war films, no obvious propaganda. Instead, the military showed Americana musicals, comedies, family dramas, westerns. Show them Meet Me in SD, Louis and It's a Wonderful Life, and Oklahoma. Show them American abundance, American optimism, American normalcy. Show them a civilization so wealthy and powerful that it could produce elaborate entertainment during total war. Show them families that ate 3 meals daily, children who attended school rather than factories, women who chose their husbands rather than accepting arranged marriages. Show them democracy in action, not through political lectures, but through the casual background details of Hollywood films where characters voted, criticized government, moved freely, changed jobs, owned property, spoke their minds. The psychological warfare specialists understood something profound. You could not argue someone out of totalitarian ideology, but you could show them an alternative so appealing, so abundantly superior, that the old ideology simply lost its power. Lieutenant Yamamoto watched the film and felt her old certainties crumbling. She had been raised in a militaristic society that emphasized sacrifice, discipline, obedience, and national collective identity over individual desire. Personal happiness was subordinate to national duty. Material comfort was suspect, a sign of weakness and Western decadence. The proper Japanese spirit was ascetic, disciplined, willing to endure any hardship for the emperor and the nation. She had believed this completely. She had volunteered for military service out of genuine patriotic conviction. She had commanded her field hospital with absolute dedication, working 18-hour days, sharing her soldiers' privations, accepting hunger and exhaustion as noble sacrifices. And now she watched American actors portray characters who pursued personal happiness as a legitimate goal, who valued family comfort and individual dreams, who lived in abundance without apparent shame or spiritual corruption. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. If this was decadence, why did it look like happiness? If this was weakness, why had America won the war? If this was spiritual bankruptcy, why did the Smith family appear more genuinely content than anyone she had known in Japan during the final desperate years of the war? The film reached its climax as the Smith family decided not to move to New York, choosing to stay in St. Louis for the 1904 World's Fair. The sequence depicting the fair was spectacular even by 1940 Hollywood standards. Technicolor vistas of grand pavilions, exotic exhibits from around the world, crowds of well-dressed Americans celebrating progress and technology and national pride. The fair commemorated the Louisiana Purchase, the massive land acquisition that had doubled American territory in 1803. The symbolism was unstated but clear. America was a nation of vast resources, continental scope, limitless potential. Captain Tanaka watched the World's Fair sequence and thought about the Greater East Asia Sea Prosperity Sphere, Japan's attempt to create a similar zone of influence across Asia and the Pacific. The ideology had promised Asian liberation from Western colonialism, shared prosperity through Japanese leadership, and a new order based on traditional Asian values rather than Western materialism. She had believed in this vision. She had worked to support it. But watching American Abundance circa 1903, watching crowds of immigrants and native-born citizens celebrating together, watching a civilization confident enough to showcase itself to the world. She wondered whether the CO prosperity sphere had ever been anything more than a rationalization for conquest. Japan had promised prosperity but delivered starvation. Japan had promised liberation but imposed brutal occupation. Japan had promised Asian solidarity but massacred Chinese civilians by the millions. Japan had promised victory but led the nation to nuclear destruction and unconditional surrender. The film ended. The lights came up. The 73 Japanese women officers sat in stunned silence for a long moment before the American guards gently indicated they should return to their barracks. They filed out in disciplined lines, but the discipline was mechanical now, habit rather than conviction. Something fundamental had shifted. In the barracks that night, they talked in whispers. Lieutenant Yamamoto lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. The image of the Smith family's Christmas celebration played repeatedly in her mind. She thought about her own family in Tokyo, if they had survived the firebombing. She thought about the lie she had been told and the lies she had believed. She thought about the war and wondered whether it had ever been anything but a monstrous mistake. She thought about the motion picture and the casual abundance it depicted. And she understood with sudden clarity that Japan had never possessed the industrial capacity to win a war against America. The revelation should have felt like shame. Instead, it felt like liberation. The psychological transformation occurring at Fort McClellan was not unique. Across every Japanese POW facility in American custody, similar programs produced similar results. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Japanese prisoners watched Yankee Doodle Dandy and began asking gods about American history. At Fort Sam Houston in Texas, prisoners screening Going My Way requested English language lessons to better understand the dialogue. At facilities in Hawaii, California, and the Pacific Islands, Japanese POWs exposed to American films underwent what researchers termed rapid ideological reorientation. The statistics were remarkable. By March 1946, over 80% of Japanese POWs in American custody had volunteered for the re-education program designed to prepare prisoners for return to a democratic Japan. They attended lectures on parliamentary government. They studied American history. They learned about free press and independent judiciary. They practiced voting in mock elections. They read translations of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And they watched movies, dozens of movies, hundreds of hours of Hollywood's vision of American life. The film program had strategic purpose beyond individual re-education. American occupation authorities understood that these prisoners would eventually return to Japan, where they would serve as witnesses to American civilization. They would tell their families about the abundance, the humane treatment, the motion pictures. They would carry back first-hand knowledge that contradicted years of militarist propaganda. They would become, in effect, ambassadors for democracy in a nation that desperately needed such ambassadors. The Pacific War had ended with nuclear weapons and unconditional surrender, but the peace would be won or lost in the hearts and minds of ordinary Japanese people. If they could be convinced that democracy was superior to militarism, that material abundance was achievable through free market capitalism, that individual rights were preferable to collective subservience, then Japan might become a stable democratic ally rather than a resentful defeated enemy waiting for another war. The film programs were psychological warfare, certainly, but they were also an investment in future peace. Lieutenant Yamamoto attended every subsequent film screening at Fort McClellan. She watched Since You Went Away and The Best Years of Our Lives and State Fair. She watched westerns where individuals carved civilization from wilderness through personal initiative. She watched musicals where women chose their own husbands based on love rather than family arrangement. She watched comedies where characters mocked politicians and bureaucrats without fear of punishment. Each film added another layer to her evolving understanding of American culture. The abundance was real. The freedom was real. The casual confidence was real. And Japan had attacked this civilization believing it to be weak and decadent. The irony was almost too bitter to contemplate. She began attending English classes. She volunteered for the re-education program. She studied American government with the intensity she had once devoted to military logistics. When the instructors distributed copies of the Constitution in Japanese translation, she read it 3 times, her mind struggling to comprehend a document that began, "We the people," rather than divine imperial mandate. She learned about checks and balances, separation of powers, Bill of Rights, federalism. She learned that Americans could criticize their government, vote officials out of office, own property without state permission, practice any religion, speak and write freely, move anywhere within the vast nation. She learned that these rights were not privileges granted by benevolent rulers, but inherent freedoms that government existed to protect. The transformation was not universally smooth. Some Japanese officers resisted the re-education efforts. They maintained loyalty to the emperor and the old ideology. They dismissed the films as propaganda, the abundance as temporary wartime measures that would collapse in peacetime. They clung to their beliefs despite all evidence. But they were a minority, and they grew smaller with each passing month. The majority, like Lieutenant Yamamoto, underwent genuine ideological conversion. The psychological term was deprogramming, though the process was voluntary. No one forced the prisoners to attend films or classes. No one punished those who refused. The American approach was to offer the alternative and let the prisoners choose. The statistics suggested that when given a choice between militaristic ideology and democratic abundance, most people chose abundance. By April 1946, Lieutenant Yamamoto was teaching English classes to other Japanese prisoners. By June, she was assisting American instructors in the rare education program, translating materials and helping explain democratic concepts to women raised in totalitarian culture. By August, she was writing letters to her family in Tokyo, carefully describing her experiences, knowing the letters would be read by censors but hoping some message would get through. She wrote about the food, the medical care, the warm buildings. She wrote about the motion pictures and the casual abundance they depicted. She wrote about studying American government. She wrote about learning English. She did not write about her ideological transformation. Such things could not be explained in letters. But she hoped her family would read between the lines and understand that she had discovered something important, something that contradicted everything they had been taught, something that suggested a better path forward for Japan. The symbolic object that haunted her thoughts was not bandages or food or weapons, but the movie projector itself. That simple machine, threading celluloid through sprockets, casting light on a bedsheet screen, had accomplished what no amount of military defeat could achieve. It had shown her an alternative civilization functioning at such a superior level that her old ideology simply lost relevance. The projector was American industrial capacity made tangible. The film stock was American chemical engineering. The camera technology was American innovation. The distribution network was American infrastructure. The content was American culture. And the casual ability to produce such elaborate entertainment during total war was American abundance. Every element of the motion picture experience demonstrated superiority that could not be denied or rationalized away. The projector had defeated militarism more thoroughly than the atomic bombs, because it operated on the level of ideas and aspirations rather than force. You could resent bombs, but you wanted to watch movies. You could hate conquest, but you envied abundance. You could resist occupation, but you craved the lifestyle depicted in Meet Me in St. Louis. The historical evidence supports this interpretation. Post-war studies of Japanese repatriation showed that former POWs exposed to American rare education programs became significantly more likely to support democratic reforms during the occupation period. They voted in higher percentages. They participated in civic organizations. They advocated for women's rights and labor rights and educational reform. They rejected militarism and ultranationalism. They became, in effect, the vanguard of democratic transformation in post-war Japan. The American occupation authorities recognized this and actively recruited former POWs for government and educational positions. Lieutenant Yamamoto returned to Japan in December 1946. By 1948, she was teaching English at a girls' school in Yokohama. By 1950, she was working for the Civil Information and Education section of Supreme Commander Allied Powers, helping design curriculum for democratic education. By 1952, when the occupation ended and Japan regained sovereignty, she was a committed Democrat who had devoted her post-war life to ensuring that the militaristic ideology that had led Japan to disaster would never return. She was not alone. Thousands of former Japanese POWs underwent similar transformations. They became teachers, journalists, government officials, business leaders. They carried forward the lessons learned in American POW camps, particularly the lesson that democracy and abundance were connected. Free people were prosperous people. Open societies were innovative societies. Nations that protected individual rights were nations that won wars and built wealth. The military government that had controlled Japan since the 1930s had promised strength through unity and discipline. They had delivered catastrophe. Democracy promised something different, messy, argumentative, individualistic, but ultimately more powerful because it harnessed human initiative rather than suppressing it. The former POWs had seen this principle demonstrated in motion pictures before they understood it intellectually. They had watched American families pursue happiness as individuals while simultaneously contributing to a collective prosperity that Japan's forced collectivism had never achieved. The film screenings at Fort McClellan continued through 1946 and into early 1947 as the last Japanese prisoners were repatriated. Each group of women officers received the same carefully curated film education. Each group underwent similar psychological transformation. The program expanded to male POW camps with equal success. By the time the last Japanese prisoner returned home, over 50,000 had been exposed to American films as part of their captivity experience. The psychological warfare specialists measured the program's success not in immediate behavior changes, but in long-term ideological shifts. The reports were classified at the time, but later released to historians. They documented a remarkably effective soft power operation that cost relatively little: film prints, projectors, electricity, guard time, but produced outsized results. The cost of showing Meet Me in St. Louis to Japanese POWs was negligible. The impact on post-war Japanese society was substantial. The women officers who wept in Recreation Hall B became teachers who educated the next generation. They became mothers who raised children without militaristic ideology. They became voters who supported democratic reforms. They became witnesses who testified that American abundance was real and American democracy was viable. Lieutenant Yamamoto lived until 2003, dying at age 84 in Yokohama. She gave several interviews to historians researching the POW experience. In one interview conducted in 1998, she described the first film screening at Fort McClellan with remarkable clarity. "I remember the white sheet on the wall," she said in fluent English. "I remember the projector starting. I remember the shock when the screen filled with color. We had been told Americans were barbarians who tortured prisoners. Instead, they showed us Judy Garland singing. The contradiction was so complete that something broke inside me. I realized everything we had been taught was a lie. Not an exaggeration or a distortion, but a complete fabrication. And if they had lied about American barbarism, what else had they lied about?" The question opened a door I could not close again. I spent the rest of my life walking through that door, learning what lay beyond the lies. What I found was democracy, abundance, and freedom. I found the civilization that Japan could become if we had the courage to embrace change. The motion picture did not argue for these things. It simply showed them as normal life. That was more powerful than any argument. Her testimony echoes across thousands of similar accounts from Japanese POWs who experienced American captivity. The consistent theme is shock at the disconnect between propaganda and reality, followed by rapid ideological reorientation once the propaganda framework collapsed. The film screenings emerge repeatedly in these testimonies as pivotal moments. Something about watching Hollywood movies made the abstract concrete. Reading about American abundance was one thing. Seeing it depicted casually in entertainment films was another. The films were not designed as propaganda, they were simply American culture, exported directly into the minds of enemy officers. But precisely because they were not designed as propaganda, they were effective as psychological warfare. They showed America as Americans saw themselves, which was more persuasive than any carefully crafted message could be. The Fort McClellan film program ended in early 1947 as the last Japanese prisoners departed for repatriation. Recreation Hall B returned to its ordinary function as a gathering space for American servicewomen stationed at the facility. The projector was cleaned and stored. The bedsheet screen was folded away, but the impact rippled forward through decades. The women who watched Meet Me in St. Louis that December evening in 1945 carried the experience back to Japan, where they became agents of transformation. Their children grew up in the democracy and abundance they had helped establish. Their grandchildren inherited a Japan that was peaceful, prosperous, and democratic. Everything the militarist government had claimed was impossible under American influence. The motion picture that made them weep with its casual abundance became a symbol of what Japan could achieve by embracing the very values the militarists had condemned. The strategic irony was profound. Japan attacked America believing it to be weak, decadent, and spiritually bankrupt. America responded with overwhelming industrial might, demonstrating that the supposed decadence was actually strength and the supposed weakness was actually power. But military victory alone could not have transformed Japan from militaristic empire to democratic ally. That transformation required changing minds, not just defeating armies. The film programs were part of that mental transformation. They operated on the level of aspiration and possibility. They showed Japanese officers a vision of what ordinary life could be if the nation chose democracy and capitalism over militarism and command economy. And remarkably, when given that choice, most of them chose democracy. Not because they were forced, but because they were shown. Not because they were argued into it, but because they watched it on a bedsheet screen in an Alabama recreation hall and understood that the propaganda had been a lie and the truth was better than anything they had imagined. The epilogue to this story is written in the Japan that emerged from the ruins of total defeat. By 1960, Japan was experiencing an economic miracle that would transform it into the world's second largest economy. By 1970, Japanese democracy was stable and mature, with peaceful transfers of power and robust civil society. By 1980, Japanese industrial production rivaled American output in several sectors. By 1990, Japan was a cultural and economic superpower, exporting cars and electronics and pop culture around the world. This transformation was possible because the post-war generation rejected militarism and embraced the democratic model demonstrated in POW camps. The women who wept watching Meet Me in St. Louis became teachers, administrators, activists, and mothers who ensured their children grew up in a different Japan, a Japan that valued peace over conquest, prosperity over glory, individual rights over collective subservience. They remembered the motion picture and the abundance it depicted, and they built a nation where such abundance became ordinary reality. Lieutenant Haruko Yamamoto returned to Fort McClellan once. In 1985, as part of a delegation of former Japanese POWs visiting American sites that had housed them during captivity. She was 66 years old, retired from teaching, grandmother of 5. She stood in Recreation Hall B and looked at the northern wall where the bedsheet screen had hung 40 years earlier. The hall was used for aerobics classes now. Loud music played from a boombox. American servicewomen in athletic gear stretched and exercised. Lieutenant Yamamoto stood quietly in the corner, remembering. An American colonel, assigned as escort for the Japanese delegation, asked if she had memories of this place. Many memories, she replied in English. This is where I learned that everything I believed was wrong. This is where I discovered democracy. This is where I watched an American family celebrate Christmas and realized that abundance and freedom were connected. This is where I decided to devote my life to making sure Japanese children grew up in a country that valued happiness over sacrifice. This is where I became who I am, the colonel, who had read briefings on the POW film programs but had trouble believing motion pictures could have such profound effects. Asked whether a single movie really changed her ideology, Lieutenant Yamamoto smiled. Not just the movie, she said. Everything. The food, the medical care, the warm buildings, the guards who treated us with respect. But the movie made it real. The movie showed me that American abundance was not military propaganda. It was normal life. And if Americans lived like that while fighting a global war, then everything we had been taught about American weakness was a lie. Once I knew one lie, I began questioning everything. The movie was the doorway. What lay beyond the doorway was democracy. And I walked through. She returned to Japan and lived another 18 years, dying peacefully in 2003, surrounded by family in a prosperous democratic nation that would have been unimaginable to the young officer who attempted suicide on Saipan in 1944. Her story, multiplied across thousands of similar transformations, explains how Japan transitioned from militaristic empire to democratic ally in a single generation. The motion picture was not the cause of that transformation, but it was a catalyst, a moment when propaganda met reality and shattered against the force of demonstrated abundance. The bedsheet screen in Recreation Hall B was a battlefield where ideology fought fact and lost. The projector was a weapon more powerful than the B-29 bombers that had destroyed Japanese cities, because it targeted not cities but minds, not infrastructure but belief systems. And the film stock running through the sprockets was ammunition that could not be defended against, because it showed rather than told, demonstrated rather than argued, revealed rather than concealed. The Japanese women officers who sat in rigid rows that December evening in 1945 expected propaganda. They received truth. They expected indoctrination. They received demonstration. They expected American barbarism. They received Judy Garland singing "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," and the contradiction was so complete, so overwhelming, so undeniable that their old world collapsed and a new one became possible. The white bedsheet screen remains in the historical record as a symbol of soft power at its most effective. It represents the moment when American culture defeated Japanese militarism, not through force, but through appeal, not through conquest, but through aspiration, not through distraction, but through demonstration. The women who wept that evening became witnesses to a truth that propaganda could not obscure. Free people build abundance. Open societies create prosperity. Democracy delivers what totalitarianism only promises. The motion picture showed this truth in technicolor glory, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Once understood, it could not be unlearned. Once experienced, it could not be forgotten. The projector in Recreation Hall B cast light that traveled across decades and generations, illuminating a path from militarism to democracy, from sacrifice to abundance, from ideology to reality. And 73 Japanese women officers, sitting in disciplined rows on wooden folding chairs, followed that light out of darkness and into a new world that their training had told them did not exist, but their eyes now confirmed was real. They learned that evening that surrender could mean liberation, that defeat could mean discovery, that captivity could mean freedom. They learned that the enemy they had feared was the ally they needed. They learned that the civilization they had attacked was the civilization they wanted to join. And they learned it all from a motion picture projected on a bedsheet screen in an Alabama recreation hall while winter wind blew through pine trees and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the December darkness. The film ended. The lights came up. The old world died. And in its place, possibility emerged, fragile, tentative, but undeniably real.